Would you like to be a part of this history?
Yes, I would.
You know you're watching Martin Scorsese if there's an unlikable protagonist, often played by Robert De Niro. The Rupert Pupkins, Travis Bickles, and Jake LaMotta's of the world make viewers cringe. Scorsese forces us to identify with this person who makes us uncomfortable.
I got some bad ideas in my head.
Film professor Julian Cornell explained to us,
none of us wants to be Travis Bickle. While we often aspire to be like sports stars, we don't want to be like Jake LaMotta. And Scorsese asks us to feel and understand these characters that are objectively unlikable.
In another director's films, we'd be encouraged to eventually find such characters sympathetic. But Scorsese actively prevents this by having his protagonists act out in repulsive ways.
A lot of you are probably wondering why Jerry isn't with us tonight. Well, I'll tell you, the fact is he's tied up, and I'm the one who tied him.
We're not here to like this person, but to witness a study of the human condition.
Loneliness has followed me my whole life, everywhere.
This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. Scorsese's most iconic protagonists are studies in insecure masculinity.
Did you my brother? Huh?
Get off me, you fat pig!
They grapple with deep-seated feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy.
I got these small hands. I got like little girls' hands.
Scorsese's insecure male is often obsessed with a cool blonde goddess. Raging Bull's Vicki, Taxi Driver's Betsy, and Casino's Ginger are almost religiously revered by the destructive man as angelic, more than human.
She was wearing a white dress. She appeared like an angel.
The protagonist is obsessed with this woman most of all because she feels unattainable. When Travis is watching Betsy, she appears like a remote apparition separated from the camera by many moving, chaotic bodies before the shot dissolves into an extreme close-up on words from Travis's diary. They cannot touch her. Vicki is associated with water, and like a liquid that can't be held, she always seems to be slipping away from Jake. When they meet, they're on opposite sides of a fence, separated by a screen of sorts that obscures her face with cross-hatching. So from the start, he can't quite see her for who she is, and he seems to want her to stay out of reach, stoking his frustration. When Vicki finally leaves Jake, she's obscured by the windows of the car, cut off for good, as he always expected her to be.
Gennar's an up-and-coming fighter. He's good-looking, he's popular. You beat him now.
Excuse me, what do you mean good looking?
The blonde goddesses reflect back to the obsessed men their own insecurities, often leading them to act out in jealous, violent abuse.
You're in a hell, and you're gonna die in a hell like the rest of you. Come on now.
Jake's Madonna horror complex twists his physical desire into rampant paranoia and suspicion of Vicki's character.
I just want to ask you one thing. Why did you Joey?
Get away!
Open the door.
No.
Rather than wanting to truly be with this woman, the man strives to possess his idea of her. His futile desire for this idealized perfection drives him mad, and his toxic worship frequently derails the woman's life.
He makes me stick around to see my own friends.
In The Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort chases Margot Robbie's character as a trophy, embodying the materialistic, hedonistic lifestyle he delights and takes pride in. But this good life slips through his fingers, and his downfall is expressed in her loss of respect for him, as she comes to see him as a fool.
You're a sick man!
In The Age of Innocence, after Michelle Pfeiffer and Daniel Day-Lewis's characters feel they have to repress their love, over time he cherishes the dream of her so much that he decides not to ruin it by trying to touch it in real life.
You really won't come at all?
I don't know.
Scorsese's habit of using female characters as symbols to help work out the male issues can invite feminist critiques. Meryl Streep said in 2011, "I would like Martin Scorsese to be interested in a female character once in a while, but I don't know if I'll live that long."
Didn't you ever hear of women's lib?
The blonde goddess also can't help but make us think of one of Scorsese's key influences, Hitchcock. And perhaps she grows out of an homage to the Hitchcock blonde. Hitchcock's Vertigo is also explicitly about the quest to overcome masculine insecurities by possessing a blonde apparition. In Hitchcock, and especially in Scorsese looking back at Hitchcock, this woman with her light reflective hair really symbolizes cinema itself. She's a pure image, untouchable and immaterial. So the man's obsession with a woman he can't hold or really know or understand is our inability to get inside cinema's projections of light. Often there's a charismatic false father figure.
Man makes his own way. No one gives it to you.
have to take it.
This figure embodies how authorities can be seductive yet unscrupulous and often can't be trusted. Scorsese uses a trademark expressionist style to paint his character's psychology. He achieves this expressionism through techniques like slow motion, freeze frames, distorted perspectives, long tracking shots set to voiceover and music, and rapid rhythmic editing. Let's look in more detail at each of these. Scorsese is renowned for his experimental use of slow motion, which intensifies our attention, creating moments that seem to exist out of time. Betsy appears in slow-mo, filmed from a distance the way Travis sees her. Jake also sees Vicki for the first time in slow motion, while the audio and reverse shots play in regular speed. From Jake's perspective, she slows the entire world down. Later, slow-mo also expresses Jake's paranoid obsession with Vicki. Here again, the sound plays at regular speed.
Rita, look who's here.
The real world continues on the same, but Jake's jealousy monopolizes his attention. Freeze frames emphasize important details or symbolic images. Henry Hill has a freeze frame moment when he recalls the exact instant that Jimmy Conway's allure began to wear off.
That's when I knew I would never have come back from Florida alive.
In The King of Comedy, the shot of Masha's hands pressed to the window of Jerry Langford's limo, backlit by a flashbulb, serves as an encapsulation of the film itself, a study of outsiders trying to break through the glass into the seemingly untouchable world of celebrity. Professor Mark Lapadula told us,
King of Comedy is a movie about the idea of this obsession with fame in America, and this obsession to be famous even if you don't have a talent. This was way before the Kardashians and all these reality shows came into existence, and it was really prescient in the way that if you do something horrible, you're well known.
Scorsese pairs virtuoso long tracking shots with theatrical voiceovers and rock music to coax the audience into his worlds, giving them a sex appeal that's often hand in hand with danger or corruption. Jordan Belfort in The Wolf of Wall Street acts as a sort of ringmaster for capitalism as carnal pleasure, and Scorsese dazzles us with fluid 360-degree dolly shots to make us feel similarly unstoppable. Seduction is also the name of the game in Goodfellas' famous 3-minute, 3-second tracking shot, where Henry Hill leads Karen into the Copacabana Club. The uninterrupted shot bewitches us with its dreamlike continuity, just as Henry's power and access overwhelm Karen.
Gave them $20 each.
Sorry. Beautifully choreographed long takes also establish settings as all-consuming forces unto themselves. In the Age of Innocence, the Steadicam dancing through the Gilded Age interiors revels in the spectacle of wealth that surrounds and ultimately entraps these characters. A swift-moving, even aggressive camera energizes characters at the top of their game. In Raging Bull, the camera even swings in 360-degree arcs and falls to the ground, as though it were struck by a punch.
Another interesting thing about Scorsese is his use of moving camera. And there's very often a disparity between these elaborately choreographed, long moving camera shots, most famously in Goodfellas, and the stillness of some of the other images. And that's where the feel of Scorsese's films is different. They're very kinetic, very visceral, because of the movement of the camera. There's this freedom of moving through space, and that's contrasted to often the constriction of the individual by their social forces, or more importantly in Scorsese, their own self-destructive behavior.
Rapid or rhythmic editing builds a powerful atmosphere and emotional response, and can be used to break a character down. In The Gangs of New York's opening battle scene, the quick rhythm of the editing evokes the slicing of the knives. Scorsese shapes the physical space of his films to evoke his characters' distorted perspectives. The boxing rings in Raging Bull change sizes to reflect LaMotta's psychology. When he's on his game, feeling like the big man, they're tiny. Other times, they're huge, signaling that he's diminishing in importance, losing control, and feels the world is escaping him. The King of Comedy visits imaginary spaces that are physical projections of Rupert Pupkin's mental state. This space, echoing with canned applause and laughter, visualizes a vacuous and self-enclosed personality, obsessed with celebrity and delusions of grandeur. In Goodfellas, the Vertigo-inspired dolly zoom when Henry and Jimmy meet at the diner subliminally unsettles the audience, just as Henry's own worldview is pulled out from under him during the scene. Last but definitely not least of his expressionistic techniques, music. A rock soundtrack is Scorsese at his most Scorsese. His films are seen as part musical, and his career is a testament to the fact that sometimes the perfect pop cue says it all.
All the way from Memphis.
Come rain or come shine.
It's hard to even hear the song Gimme Shelter without thinking of this director. In Goodfellas, the song returns as a motif, highlighting the growing instability of Henry Hill's lifestyle, in which the end of it all may be just a shot away. The Stones sound contrasts with the nostalgic 50s Phil Spector girl group sound that makes up the fabric of the first half of the film. As time passes in the story, the period-appropriate progression from 50s pop to 70s rock evokes the arc of lost innocence that Henry goes through, as the music introduces harsher textures and a cool brand of cynicism. Scorsese frequently pulls in multiple expressionistic techniques together to achieve his desired effect.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
In the sequence when we first meet Sharon Stone's Ginger in Casino, Scorsese uses a freeze frame, a slow track inward on De Niro, a pop music cue with lyrics that comment on the scene, "You're the one," and a perspective-shifting shot as she walks away in slow motion. Cinematic jackpot, as they might say in Casino.
Boom shaka!
There's memorable, hyper-aesthetic violence, which Scorsese portrays with brutal realism, rapid cuts, slow motion, swift aggressive camera movements, striking angles, and dynamic music cues. Scorsese is fascinated by violence as an inescapable part of human nature.
The spectacle of fearsome acts. Somebody steals from me, I cut off his hands. He offends me, I cut out his tongue.
At times, the immediacy of the camera, edit, and music can make us identify, swept up in the thrill of the acts. Yet by the end of a Scorsese film, we reject that identification, as Scorsese illustrates that violence is never the answer.
Violence is never cathartic. Even in Taxi Driver, where Travis feels that his violence is cathartic, it turns out not to be. And so violence is always the most awful thing that a human being can do to one another. And he uses that as a way to explore this larger question of the casual violence we do, the emotional violence that we do to one another as we pursue our individual needs and goals. And violence is something that in the American tradition is very often seen as redemptive. And for Scorsese, it's never redemptive. Redemption comes from somewhere else. We may think it's in violence, but it's not.
Often, Scorsese's films aren't really about what they seem to be about.
I find that his films are often not even about what they say they're about. Raging Bull is not about boxing. It's the animal within us all, the rage within us all, the anger that we carry with us. In Wolf of Wall Street, it's the greed, this kind of selfishness and narcissism and trying to achieve these goals purely to pursue them.
You got all the money in the world. You need everybody else's money?
Goodfellas, I think, is the desire to live a life that's exciting. I mean, that Henry Hill talks about that in the film, where he wanted to be like the gangsters simply because their lives seemed more interesting.
It meant being somebody in a neighborhood that was full of nobodies. They weren't like anybody else. I mean, they did whatever they wanted. They double parked in front of a hydrant and nobody ever gave them a ticket.
They didn't have dead-end lives, even though their lives often ended up in death. They just seemed to be living larger than life. But in the end, they don't really even achieve that.
The Irishman isn't really about the mob, it's about aging and mortality.
Sooner or later, everybody put here as a date when he's gonna go. That's just the way it is.
A number of Scorsese's films are really about Catholic guilt, or struggles with faith and the way our religious experience shapes us. This is a theme that's close to home for Scorsese, who once wanted to be a priest.
You don't make up for your sins in the church. You do it in the streets. You do it at home.
But his characters are often plagued by their religious ideas, boxed into situations where they can't escape the need to sin, or they find it's not straightforward to decipher the path of a good spiritual man. Scorsese's films also tend to be about self-destruction.
If I hear anything, I swear on our mother, I'm gonna kill somebody.
Well, go ahead and kill everybody. You're a tough guy, go kill people. You're killing yourself the way you eat.
Jake beats up his family members and himself, literally. Ending the film alienated, alone, and unable to stop compulsively destroying himself.
I don't think there's a director who's as able to portray characters who are inherently self-destructive, doing something that will not benefit them, and seemingly unable to stop doing so.
Scorsese's also known for his gritty depictions of New York.
I go all over. I take people to the Bronx, Brooklyn, I take them to Harlem.
The director grew up in an apartment on Elizabeth Street in Little Italy. Mean Streets, which relied heavily on the director's memories of acquaintances involved in crime, keeps itself confined to the blocks of Little Italy and falls apart when Charlie and Johnny Boy attempt to drive out of the city. Taxi Driver takes us uptown to Harlem and to the seedy areas around Times Square.
This city here is like an open sewer, you know? It's full of filth and scum. And sometimes I can hardly take it.
The king of comedy plays with Midtown extras reacting to celebrities like Jerry Lewis walking down the street. After Hours plops an ineffectual uptowner into a wild, artsy Soho. Bringing Out the Dead captures the underside of New York by night. Wolf of Wall Street takes us to the one percenters' castles in Fidei and Westchester. Scorsese's two period films show us two different historical New Yorks, divided by about a decade and vast class differences.
New York was a city full of tribes, war chiefs.
Through these many New Yorks, Scorsese reveals how characters are shaped and confined by their precise environment. And he shows us how these diverse subcultures and experiences coexist in one enormous urban microcosm of humanity. Scorsese likes to make self-referential cameos, which you might say is yet another update to Hitchcock. Hitchcock's famous cameos sometimes sent subtle thematic clues. In Strangers on a Train, he carries a double bass, underscoring the film's motif of doubles. In North by Northwest, we see him miss the bus, setting the tone for Cary Grant's narrative mishaps. Scorsese builds on this with cameos that are frequently self-reflexive, allowing him to, literally, direct the narrative from inside the movie. In Mean Streets, his gunshot puts an end to Charlie and Johnny Boy's getaway. In Hugo, he's a daguerreotype-era photographer, another type of image maker. In Taxi Driver, we get Scorsese's longest cameo.
There's nothing else, I'm gonna kill him. What do you think of that?
Notice how Scorsese is addressing this speech to the back of De Niro's head and working himself up, trying to elicit a reaction out of the actor. This cameo reveals that Scorsese sees the director's job as creating conditions that guide the actor towards a response. Meanwhile, on the story level, he's a narrative instigator, introducing disturbing, violent ideas into Travis's mind, which will simmer in his unconscious before exploding. Scorsese is the ultimate cinephile director. Scorsese's films are an ecstasy of influence. Think of the X's foreshadowing deaths in The Departed, a tribute to Howard Hawks' Scarface. The Vertigo-style shots of flowers in the opening credits of Age of Innocence, Hugo Cabret dangling from a clock like Harold Lloyd in Safety Last, and the use of music from Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt in Casino. In The Departed, the rhythm of the cuts when Sullivan takes a shower might call to mind the most famous shower sequence in cinema, Psycho. And one of the murder scenes is edited exactly like a murder scene in The Public Enemy, with James Cagney. Direct homages are only the tip of the iceberg. The very fabric of Scorsese's films reflects his deep knowledge of film history, such as the way that the color changes in The Aviator to match up with the way film development technologies would have appeared in each time period. Scorsese formerly studied cinema at NYU.
Martin Scorsese belongs to that generation of filmmakers that were university trained for the first time. Spielberg, Lucas, Spike Lee, Scorsese. They were real students of the cinema.
In fact, Raging Bull is dedicated to Scorsese's college mentor, Haig P. Manoogian. With this biblical quote implying that his professor taught him to see through cinema, Scorsese reveals that his guiding light is not just films themselves, but also the study and philosophy of films.
I think what Scorsese represents is someone who is constantly learning from other filmmakers. And if you listen to him speak about movies, he talks a mile a minute.
You had Stanley Kramer making certain kinds of very socially conscious films. You had Kazan doing that too, in the late 40s, early 50s. And then you had, of course, Otto Preminger.
He's somebody that is just absolutely consumed and passionate about his art form.
You could say that Scorsese has been training his whole life to become the cinephile director.
Hey, what's that movie that Bogart made?
Which one?
The one where he played a cowboy. Only the one.
The Oklahoma Kid.
Shane? Oklahoma Kid. Shane. Oklahoma Kid. That's me.
As a child, Scorsese's intense asthma made it difficult for him to play outside with other kids. His family would take him to see movies at the Roxy near Times Square. He became an avid moviegoer, absorbing and internalizing the films of Alfred Hitchcock, Italian neorealists like Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini, whose gritty aesthetics were hugely influential on Scorsese's own depictions of Italian-American New York. Akira Kurosawa, whose Rashomon would inspire some of the ensemble stagings and meditations on justice and silence, and John Ford. Mark Lapadula explains that Scorsese modeled Taxi Driver on The Searchers.
The Searchers was a very important movie for all those guys in that generation. And it's a film where the John Wayne character is a real racist. I mean, he just hates the Comanche. They're called not Comanche, they're called the Comanche.
Could be Comanche.
So there's a real parallel between these two films. These filmmakers are using classical film models in order to tell their stories of today.
Another important influence is Michael Powell. Scorsese pays tribute to his Black Narcissus in the fades to color in Age of Innocence. Powell himself inspired Scorsese's decision to make Raging Bull in black and white. When Powell saw some test footage, he remarked that De Niro's boxing gloves looked too red. Incidentally, Powell's wife, Thelma Schoonmaker, is Scorsese's longtime editor, shaping the rhythm of his films ever since Raging Bull. Scorsese's masterful documentaries also spring from his love for the arts. He tends to tackle either music that's personally inspired him or film history. A Personal Journey with Martin Scorsese Through American Movies is a loving tapestry of a film curriculum steeped in his own memories and experiences. In that spirit, Scorsese has dedicated himself to film preservation. In 1990, he founded the Film Foundation, and he's brought global cinema to wider audiences through his World Cinema Project. Scorsese's filmography explores how our inner demons lead us to self-destruct and why we're so deeply driven by the unattainable. But while his character's redemption may be limited, in the end, like his life, Scorsese's films are most of all about the love of cinema and how the right shot, the right song, and the right cut add up to that unforgettable moment of cinematic sight.
Well, then who the hell else are you talking to? Talking to me? Well, I'm the only one here.
Hey guys, this is Grace, and today I want to talk to you about one of our favorite places to watch movies, Mubi. Mubi is a treasure trove of films. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film, whether it's a movie you've been dying to see or one you've never heard of before. There is always something new to discover. So in this world where it's very easy to spend hours debating what you should watch, Mubi is like having a really cool friend with amazing taste in movies, making it so much easier for you. They feature hard-to-come-by masterpieces, indie festival darlings, influential art house and foreign films, lesser-known films by your favorite famous directors, and more. Plus, you can even download the films to watch offline, and there are no ads ever. One movie you can check out right now on Mubi is The Grief of Others, the final installment in Mubi's year-long auteur series. Patrick Wang's film, which has a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, follows a suburban family dealing with the aftermath of their son's death. We can't recommend Mubi highly enough. You can try it out now for free for a whole month. Just click the link in the description below.